everyone, welcome to this overview of anatomical language, body geography, and body cavities. So we went over some material earlier in this week and unfortunately didn't get to this content, so I wanted to make a video to highlight this information. I know some of you might want the previous information recorded and I can record it at a later date, but I wanted to make sure you got this because this will be the main component of your test next week. All right, so let's go into directional terms again. I know we went over them, but it's important stuff. So we got superior and inferior. Superior means above or towards the head, and inferior means below or towards the tail. So I could say my forehead is superior to my collarbone, and my collarbone is inferior to my forehead. Ventral or anterior and dorsal posterior. Anterior means in front of, towards the belly of the body, and posterior means the back of the body. I could say my sternum is anterior to my vertebrae, and my vertebrae are posterior to my sternum. Medial and lateral. Medial means towards the midline of the body, and lateral means away from the midline of the body. So my nose is medial to my ears, and my ears are lateral to my nose. Proximal and distal. So proximal means closer to the torso, and distal means farther away from the torso. So for example, my elbow is proximal to my wrist, meaning my elbow is closer to my trunk than my wrist is, and my wrist is distal to my elbow. And lastly is superficial and deep. Superficial means towards the surface of the body, and deep means internal, away from the surface of the body. So I could say the hairs on my forearm are superficial to the bones in my arm, and the bones in my forearm are deep to the hairs on my skin. Alright, next up are the regional terms. So it's also important when we're talking anatomy and physiology to be identifying the correct region and applying the correct directional terms to that region so we can describe where a certain structure is. So I'll briefly go over all of these wonderful regional terms. So anything that refers to the head is known as the cephalic region. And then if we want to be more specific, we got the frontal region, which is the forehead, the orbital region, which are the eyes, and the buccal region, which is the cheek, as well as the oral region, which is the mouth. The cervical region refers to your neck, and that's because the vertebrae in this area are called cervical vertebrae. Your whole chest area is called the thoracic region, and it includes on the anterior or front side your sternal region, as well as your axillary region. Your sternal region is from your sternum, and your axillary region is your armpit. You also have your acromial region, which is your upper shoulder, and then more laterally on the outside is your deltoid region. Your arm is described as the brachial region. Forearm pit is called your antebrachial region, whereas your actual elbow is your olecrational region. Then we're going to bounce over to the abdominal region, which is all your stomach, we say. Your belly button is specifically called your umbilical region, and then inferior or below that is called your pelvic region. Even more inferior to that, when you're near the genitals, it's called the inguinal region, where your groin is, and the pubic or genital region for that area. Now we have our wrist and our hand. Your wrist is referred to the carpal region, and your digits or your fingers are your digital region. For your lower limbs, your outside or most lateral part of your hip is called the coxal area. Your upper leg is called the femoral area. Your knee is the patellar area, and your knee pit or posterior to your patella is going to be your popliteal region. The anterior or shin bone side of your leg is called the crural region, and where your calf is called the sural region. Laterally to the crural and sural region is your fibular region. Your whole ankle is called the tarsal region. Your heel is called the calcaneal region. Your toes are digital, and your foot as a whole, the bottom of it, is called your plantar region. Let's go back up here to your posterior side. So the back of your head is called the occipital region, because that's where your occipital bone is and your occipitalis muscle is. Once again, your neck, posterior and anterior, is called your cervical region. Your shoulder blades, that's your scapular region. Your vertebrae or your spine is called your vertebral region. Your lower back is your lumbar region. Inferior to that, your tailbone which isn't actually what it's called. It's called your sacral region. And then the glutes are called the gluteal region. All right, we're nearing the end of this mega slides presentation. And we're gonna end with body planes and sections as well as body cavities. So when medical professionals are looking at the body and they're cutting into it, they're making specific types of sections or cuts along specific planes. And so here are the 3 types of cuts you can make, and these are the planes they're associated with. You can make a sagittal cut, which is a cut lengthwise along the body plane, right down the midline, dividing the body or organ into left and right parts. It'd be like if I took a samurai sword and put it right between my eyes all the way down my body. The frontal section is going to go up above from the top of your head, straight down, and divide your body into anterior and posterior parts. And lastly is transverse. This is going to be a horizontal cut dividing the body into superior and inferior parts. The upper body will be distinct from the lower body. It's also called a cross section. So this is what those look like. Here is our transverse section. Like I said, it's going to make your upper body distinct from your lower body, or the superior part of the structure separate from the inferior part. And then we have our frontal, also called a coronal section, and it's going to make an anterior and posterior section. And it's called this because during development, when your skull is distinct as a baby and there's a bunch of different bones, they eventually fuse together right here. There's multiple sutures is what they're called, but this suture is called the coronal suture. And if you were to cut right down this, it would leave the face and the anterior part distinct from the posterior part. And lastly is a sagittal section, which, like I said, is going to go right between the eyes if it's a mid-sagittal section, and separate the body into right and left parts. This is what these sections look like on an MRI, and I want to make clear that these sections were not cut and then put into an MRI machine, but the technology is so that it takes a 3-dimensional holistic picture of your body, and then the technician is able to make these sections using the technology they have in order to look at specific structures to see if there's any abnormalities in the body. So when we're looking at this far left one, we're looking at a transverse cut up above. So it's like you're up above the brain in this instance, looking down at it. These are ventricles in your brain, which we'll learn about later. They're filled with fluid. You can see the skull on the outside and some little cushion in there. Next is going to be a sagittal cut, and we know this because we're looking at the right side of somebody's head, which means it had to be cut right down the middle. And then lastly, this is a frontal or coronal cut. And we can tell because it doesn't look like this and it doesn't look like this, and we're actually looking at the anterior part of somebody's whole face, basically. All right, lastly, let's talk about some body cavities. So another way to organize the body is through cavities, and there are 2 main body cavities, the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity, and they include different things. The dorsal body cavity consists of the cranial and spinal cavities, which protects the brain and spinal cord respectively. And then the ventral body cavity is much, much larger and includes everything else. It can further be divided into 2, technically 3 other cavities: the thoracic cavity, the abdominal cavity, and the pelvic cavity. But oftentimes people will say the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. And since the ventral body cavity is so large, medical personnel divide it further into 4 different regions that are called quadrants. And it's called quadrants because it's divided into 4 regions. And they're named the upper right quadrant, the lower right quadrant, the upper left quadrant, the lower left quadrant. So let's take a look at these. Here we have the dorsal, or the posterior body cavity. It consists of the cranial cavity where the brain is and the vertebral cavity where the spinal cord is. And then in here, we have the thoracic body cavity, the abdominal cavity, and the pelvic cavity, which all make the ventral body cavity. Okay. There's also this structure here called the diaphragm, which is important, and it is a muscle that helps in respiration, but it also keeps your thoracic cavity, which involves your lungs as well as your heart, distinct from all of the stuff in your abdominal pelvic cavity. So for example, if you have a hole in your diaphragm, then your intestines can actually seep into your thoracic cavity where your heart and lungs are trying to work. And as you can imagine, that would be very bad, not a good thing. And so thankfully we have this muscle here that not only helps us breathe, but it keeps the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities separate. All right, so here are those quadrants I was talking about here, and they can further be broken up into 6 regions of the abdominal pelvic area. So we got the umbilical region, which is where your belly button is, and then above that is the epigastric region. Epi means above, and gastric refers to the gastrointestinal organs. And then below your belly button, or umbilical region, you have the hypogastric region, and hypo means below. If I go to the left and right of the hypogastric region, I'm going to be hanging out at the right iliac region and the left iliac region. And when you put your hands on your hips, you're actually putting them on a structure right here called the ilium. And so that's where this region of the body gets its name. If I go superior to these regions, I see the right lumbar region and the left lumbar region. And this is named because the vertebrae in your back are named the lumbar vertebrae in this region. If I go superior again, we have the left hypochondriac and the right hypochondriac region. I don't know why it's named that, and so you're just gonna have to try and figure out a way to remember that yourself. But one thing I do wanna point out is when we are looking at a model like this, this is our left side of our vision. But to the person, it's the right side of their body, and vice versa. We're looking at the right side of this picture, but it's actually the left side of this person's body. And this is why anatomical position is also important, because when we are describing bodies, we need to be describing them in reference to the person, right? If I was to say somebody has a laceration on their right hypochondriac region and you went over to this area of somebody, this is the individual's left hypochondriac region. You would need to go over here to see where the laceration or the cut was. So it's important to keep in mind that your right is their left and your left is their right. All right, very last slide. In addition to those large closed body cavities, there's also several smaller body cavities that are open. And here they are. We have our oral and digestive cavities. The oral cavity contains the mouth, teeth, and tongue, and the digestive cavity contains digestive organs in the anus. Your nasal cavity contains the nose, and it's part of the respiratory system passageways. Your orbital cavities are where your eyeballs sit, and they're presented in an anterior or forward-facing position. And lastly are your middle ear cavities, and these cavities are carved into the skull and contain your body's smallest bones to transmit sound vibrations to hearing receptors in your inner ears, which is pretty dang incredible. So that's all I have for you today. If you have any questions about what I covered, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, happy studying, and I hope you have a great day.